Hello and welcome to the Building an Indie Business podcast with SupremeRumHam. I'm your host, Alex. Today, I will be giving a product update on the podcast directory. I will discuss the iTunes API that I worked with and figured out. I will discuss my next steps with the iTunes API and the podcast directory, and the problem that I have discovered that I have to solve relating to the API and names. First, I want to discuss some general podcast things. There is the Patreon page and the Buy Me a Coffee page, which are used to improve the podcast. So every dollar donated from the Patreon page and Buy Me a Coffee page is put right back down the podcast for equipment or software that I need to improve the podcast. The difference is that the Patreon page is a monthly recurring donation, and the Buy Me a Coffee page can be a one-time donation. Okay, so let's get into it. So recently, I found a video on YouTube that helped me to work with the iTunes API. So right now, if you search Building an Indie Business on my website, that's not live, but if it were live, if you search Building an Indie Business, something would pop up. Like a little card would pop up with information about the podcast. It'd say the title, the name, and a link to it, maybe even the author's name. And that's for any podcast in iTunes. So, my next step with this, with the iTunes API, is I have to figure out how to get the data that the users add to show up with the podcast information. So my plan for this is to use an event listener, and every time the button is clicked for searching up the iTunes information, so when you type in Building an Indie Business and want that to pop up, I'm going to add another event listener on the same button that runs a function that searches my Firebase database, and will search the Firebase database for information on that podcast. And if no information from that podcast has popped up, I'm going to add an else statement and have like the form to add information to my database to pop up. So I haven't tried this yet, but I will in the next few weeks, and I will let you guys know if anything happens. The one problem I found with the iTunes API, or the way I've worked it out, is that if you type in a podcast that has multiple podcasts with that title, then it'll show all of them. So I need to figure out how to get the information from the one specific podcast that you want to add data, or the one podcast that you want to review. I need to figure out how to get that one podcast to show up instead of just a bunch of them. And then I have to figure out how to make sure that that's to connect that specific podcast to the data that you want to add. So, for example, the Maker Mag podcast is called Troublemakers. And in the video that I made, you can see that there's a bunch of podcasts with the name Troublemakers. So I have to figure out how to get the Maker Mag podcasts to only show up and not the other podcasts when you want to add data to the Maker Mag podcasts. So I will be figuring that out in the next couple of weeks. I will link to the video that showed me how to use the iTunes API. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day. You can follow me on Twitter. You can follow me. You could email me questions. I will put both those in the show notes as well. SupremeRumHam and srhpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day. Bye.